Hank Williams. I am a lifelong tech entrepreneur. Rather than talk about what I've done, what I want to do is share some ideas that come from my perspectives doing the things that I've done over the last 30 years. And specifically, today I want to talk about the relationship that I see between something a lot of us call entitlement, technology, and entrepreneurship. Before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about myself so you understand my perspective and where I'm coming from. So, I've been writing, designing computer software for more than 30 years. I started in the late 70s, the beginning of the personal computer revolution. When I got my first computer, I got a Radio Shack Model 1 TRS-80 when I was 13 years old. I was living in Lenox Terrace, about 3 blocks from here. Actually, I'm not sure if I'm in here if I'm pointing in the right direction, but about 3 blocks from here. I've started a number of companies. I've raised a few tens of millions of dollars. I've created some products. So in short, technology has been my life. At the same time, I grew up in Harlem and spent more time living here than anywhere else. Though I now live in New Jersey, I will always consider myself a Harlemite. So in the last several years, I've become incredibly concerned about the lack of diversity in my professional ecosystem, which is what I call the innovation economy. And while running my for-profit company called Cloudco, which our product's coming out probably early next year. I want everybody here to become a user. But while running my company, I decided I needed to do something else about this diversity issue, and so I also formed a nonprofit organization called Platform. Our website is platform.org. And our specific mission was how do we diversify the innovation economy. So in short, my perspective is as a frustratingly rare black technology entrepreneur who's lived most of his life in Harlem. So that frames my views, and I'm going to share one of those views with you this evening. So I'm going to give it to you up front and then work you through it. So the idea is pretty simple. Black people, people of color, particularly young black people, need to feel more entitlement, and technology skills offer a unique framework for developing that entitlement. To help frame this discussion, I'm going to share 3 stories, actually, of people that illuminate different aspects of this issue. So, the first story comes from the pages of the news in the just last week. And I'm reading now from the Associated Press. Former NFL offensive lineman Brian Holloway initially thought the Twitter photos showing young people partying at his family's second home in upstate New York were a hoax. Then he saw pictures of teenagers standing on the dining room table that he had bought with his Super Bowl bonus. Holloway's rural vacation home was trashed during a Labor Day weekend party attended by up to 400 teenagers. Holloway said that the partiers caused at least $20,000 in damage, breaking windows and doors, punching holes in walls, spraying graffiti. And he saw the whole thing unfold on Twitter. And now he's using the team's own posts on Twitter to reveal their identities and try to set them on a better path. Holloway, who played offensive tackle for the New England Patriots and Los Angeles Raiders in the 1980s, said his 19-year-old son, a University of Southern Florida sophomore, alerted him to the party after receiving tweets about it the night of August 31st. Holloway was at his home in Lutz, Florida at the time and watched as more tweets about the party were posted, many of them accompanied by photos of young people drinking throughout his home in Stephentown on the Massachusetts border, 25 miles southeast of Albany. We were getting eyewitness reports of what was happening while it was happening. We couldn't believe what was going down, Holloway told the Associated Press. Before he could call the police, more tweets reported that officers had arrived. Holloway said. The partygoers scattered across his 200-acre property, which includes the main house and a guest house, set amid the rolling countryside in the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains. So, Brian Holloway is a black man. And of course, we already know this, but the kids that did this, all 300 or 400 of them, they were all white. And you know the kids were white because you know that it's not the kind of thing that black kids do. How do we know this? Because you know that black kids would know that they could never get away with anything like this. Whereas the white kids, hundreds of them, didn't even see enough, couldn't even conceive that this was wrong, let alone that maybe they would want to hide it. They were on Twitter. Their sense of entitlement let them believe they were safe doing literally anything. And while this is a horribly negative example, it's instructive to consider the psychology. You don't get me wrong, our kids do lots of problematic things. In many of our communities, we're busy shooting and killing each other. We have violence and gangs and all kinds of other things. But those problems stem not from entitlement, but from the exact opposite of entitlement. Our kids feel unentitled. Many of them have no sense of the enormous potential that each of them has within. Many cannot imagine that school and good grades and focus and effort and drive can lead to opportunity and success. In fact, perhaps as a way to justify this frame of mind, it's become a given among many of our youth that being smart is plain uncool. That's the kind of mindset you have when you cannot imagine your own potential and your own entitlement to success. Second story I want to share is about a colleague of my wife's. My wife is a university professor, and a black professor she works with recently shared a story with her about the way he engages his students. This professor noticed that his students of color never took advantage of the opportunity to meet with him during office hours, whereas the white students did. It turns out the students of color were afraid. They did not understand that access to the professor in this way was their right. So he instituted a policy requiring that all of his students meet with him at least once during the semester, during office hours. The specific idea is to give, particularly his students of color, the understanding that they are entitled to his time and his attention and his focus. And this is a critical lesson about entitlement for all of these students that otherwise have never been taught. They are, in fact, entitled. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to suggest that I want our kids to feel entitled enough to descend on the home of a stranger with a few hundred of their closest and most destructive friends and to trash it. But I am going to tell you that having the right to access your professors in school, go to office hours, and to ask for what you need, our kids are entitled to that and much more. Indeed, in life, everything is a spectrum. And the point is that a certain amount of entitlement is absolutely critical to success. My third story is about one particular individual who used to work for me. To protect perhaps the not-so-innocent, I'll change his name and call him Paul. Now, Paul is a young white man. And while this is not the story of one person, and it may seem extreme, the pattern that it illuminates is one that I've seen throughout my career as a technologist. Paul is only marginally unique. Now, Paul was always an odd fellow, but the interesting thing is that at 25 or 6, he had problems at literally every place he'd worked. And so it was after a few years with us, Paul decided he became disgruntled, that he was not on track to be a partner and leader of the company, and so eventually Paul left. And so after being with us, being the smart fellow that he was, his next job was at Google. Almost exactly, in fact I think it was exactly 6 months after being hired by Google, Paul departed. He claims he left because, truth be told, he claims he left, but truth be told, very few people leave what many people consider to be the best place to work in the world. after 6 months even. So I'm skeptical, particularly given that he was unemployed after he left. My sense was Paul was in some way, shape, or form pushed out. But the one thing I can say for sure is that in the 6 brief months working at Google, Paul became famous, or perhaps more accurately stated, infamous, inside Google. At the end of his 6 months, he had decided that he knew better than his managers, his co-workers, and everyone else in the organization how things should be run and what their product strategies should be. And he didn't just decide this privately. He took to writing his voluminous thoughts on his blog. Paul never managed anybody, who'd never raised any money, who'd never founded a company, who'd never conceived a product used by anybody, and who had been at Google exactly 6 months. And what in God's name gave this young man the belief that any of his ideas about anything were worth anything, particularly in the context of one of the most successful companies in the world? The answer, of course, is that he was extraordinarily entitled. But the deeper question is, how did he get that way? Well, first, he was white, and that, as we've discussed, helps. But his level of entitlement was above the norm. And here's my somewhat novel, but I think important answer to that question. How did he get that way? He learned to become a very good programmer. Now, I once again need to clarify and disclaim, Paul is an insanely foolish outlier. Most people who learn how to program do not develop this level of distortion of perspective. But the interesting thing is that Paul isn't that much of an outlier. If you go to a website known as Hacker News, a popular website a very popular website, primarily populated by programmers and tech entrepreneurs, you'll see on a daily basis some blend of accomplished and not so accomplished people giving their firm and confident opinions about things that are often, in fact, I would say primarily, far beyond the scope of their competence and experience. I have to admit, I find this personally exceedingly annoying. But here's the thing. While I find these characteristics annoying, I think it should be clear the entitlement, the confidence, or even overconfidence in one's own ability has real value. And one of the things that's not at all obvious to those that do not know how to program is that learning to program gives you that confidence. It's truly an extraordinary thing. There's little more powerful or magical than being able to create something from scratch by yourself that is complex and at the same time valuable. Something that requires skill and mental toughness, and to create something that is provably correct. Writing software is not like writing an article or a book. If you write a great book chapter, there's no machine that tests it to see if it does what was intended. But with software, something called a compiler reads your work and verifies it and tells you when you made a mistake, exactly where you went wrong, and you get that feedback immediately. And when you're done writing a program, you know that you've done it right, because if you haven't, it just doesn't work. So there's nothing subjective about it. You can point to your accomplishment with confidence that you did something well. And this dynamic breeds confidence. You truly feel different when you learn how to create things. And anything, but in my case, particularly software, but I think it's particularly instructive when thinking about technology and software. There's another critical element to success, which I call grit. And the interesting thing about learning to program is that it not only instills confidence, it helps you develop grit. Grit is that stick-to-itiveness, to see tough challenges through, to be able to see around the corner to the value of your work, to delay the short-term gratification for the benefit of the longer-term good. My view is that what makes a successful entrepreneur is both grit and confidence. And within our community, I think we could use a booster shot of both of these strengths. And more importantly, if we start young, I think these are traits that our young people can absolutely learn if we expose them to the kind of skills that inspire them. So my message today is not about the importance of learning to code for its own sake or because of any direct benefits. My belief, informed by my 30 years of observation, is that through this easy-to-teach when young skill, we have the capacity to rewire our collective cultural brains. And whether that leads to entrepreneurship or just developing the critical thinking skills to be successful in another field doesn't really matter. The simple act of encouraging our young people to learn to program can hold the key to remaking our next generation by allowing them to feel entitled and empowered, to see the greatness that is already within them. My example of Paul is not one, and while my example of Paul is not one to be replicated, there are myriad examples of people succeeding today because through programming they came to understand their true power in the world. Our kids can, and in fact need to learn this power too.